All right. My drawing is a little cluttered at the moment. I'm going to erase these circles. Now, if I highlight all these objects, I can do one of two things. I can either push the delete key on my keyboard, or I can type E at the command prompt and push the spacebar. Either way, it amounts to the same thing. Now, I'm going to make a few copies of this rectangle. So, copy, and I'm just going to stack these copies directly on top of each other, just like this. And I'll also make a few extras right here. That didn't quite line up. I'll delete him. And I'll pan by holding down the scroll wheel on my mouse and moving my mouse so that I can get this centered in the view screen. Now the stretch command, those of you familiar with Illustrator or something like that, this works a bit similar to modifying the boundary edges of a complex shape. It's not quite the same, but it comes relatively close. And the stretch command will only work with a selection or with a crossing window. So what I want to do is I want to move, or I want to stretch this middle section here, but I want to keep both of these edge sections exactly where they are. So I'm going to start on the right-hand side of this grouping. I'll left-click and release, and I will move my cursor down so it looks like this. Left-click again. I'm done selecting my objects, so I'll push return. And now it's the same base point, which is where do you want to move from. And I'll just left-click. Where do I want to move to? Now I can leave this constrained on an axis. I can move it in either direction. I can move it up and down. I can move it off axis. I can move it any direction, any distance and angle that I want to. And right now, I just want to keep it in a straight line. And you'll notice from the previous videos, I still have that little green dashed line that's indicating sort of a rubber banding axis that's similar to holding the Shift key in Illustrator or Photoshop. And let's just say I want to move this 3 units. So I'll type in 3, push return, and I've just stretched that. Let's do the same thing over here, except I want to stretch the top and the bottom one, but I want to leave the middle one alone. There's a couple of different ways to do this, and I'll show you first on one side, and then I'll show you a different way on the other. I'll start the stretch command again, and that's just S at the command prompt and press return. I always start my stretch command by a crossing window, which means I'm starting my cursors on the right-hand side of the objects that I want to select. Left-click and release, and I'll move my crosshairs down and to the left, and I will left-click and release. But I want to remove that one. I only want to affect the top and the bottom rectangle. So I will hold my Shift key, and I will select this object, and it will remove it from the selection set. I'm done selecting my objects. I will press return. Now I want to move these items, or stretch these items rather, 3 units to the right. So, and it doesn't matter if I left click on an object or if I just click out in space, but I'm going to start here by clicking on an object, and I'll left click and release. Move my cursor in the direction that I want to go, type in the distance that I want to travel, push a space bar, and I'm done. So that's one way to remove part of what you want to stretch. Another way of doing it, and this one actually requires that there's some space in between these elements. So I'm going to go back and use my move tool, and I'm going to move that up 1 inch, and move these 2 objects up 1 inch, just so I have a little bit of breathing room in between here. So I'm going to start my stretch command again. I'm going to start here. Cursor on the upper right-hand corner of the vertices that I want to modify with this stretch command. And I'm going to hold down my mouse, my left mouse button, as I drag my way around and create a stretching lasso. I'm done selecting my objects. I push return. I want to move these 2.5 units to the right. So I'm just going to left click in outer space, move my cursor in the direction I want to go. I'm still rubber banded on a nice orthogonal axis. Key in 2.5 inches, push the spacebar. And not just with a lasso, and you might have seen this. When I start my stretch command, it doesn't say anything about a crossing lasso, but it does say a crossing polygon. It's a little bit different. At this point, if I type in P, no, that's P for previous, CP for crossing polygon, I believe. Yes. And instead of dragging the lasso around, I can click and release my way around the same objects. It's a few additional keystrokes to remember. It's not quite as intuitive as holding the mouse key down, but it amounts to the same thing. Move my cursor in the direction I want to go, enter in my distance, push return. There you go. There's the stretch command.